just like a race car is going to influence the strategy that a race car driver has on the racetrack, the same is true for any learning technology that you have, and especially a learning management systems. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Practical Learning Professional. My name is Matt Jertson, founder and chief learning officer of Better Everyday Studios. And today I'm going to talk about everyone's favorite subject, learning management systems. Okay, I know it's probably not actually everyone's favorite subject. To be honest, it's one of those things that frustrates a lot of people in learning. But for better or for worse, learning management systems are really core to what we're trying to do in learning. If you're someone who's been in the learning profession before, you've probably experienced that fact that no matter how many learning systems you look at, they always seem like they're made for someone else, right? Like they're never quite doing everything that you want them to do. Essentially, everyone I've ever talked to is always looking for another learning management system. If you're somebody who's newer to the profession, or maybe you're in HR, starting a business and just starting to think about learning, and you're getting really excited about going out and getting this great piece of technology that everyone is telling you is gonna change your world. It will change your world. Like they're very powerful, but they always have a lot of limitations, and they can actually be pretty hard to understand. And so what I want to do today is help give you a few simple questions that you can ask to really understand the foundation of any learning management system really quickly. Because when you get the typical sales pitch, they're going to talk up how much content they have connected into the system, about the way that it involves social learning, or just the ease at which you can create content. But none of that is really at the heart of what's going to drive your learning strategy and how you're going to use the learning management system to implement that strategy. Because just like a race car is going to influence the strategy that a race car driver has on the racetrack, the same is true for any learning technology that you have, and especially a learning management system. Since, again, for better or for worse, in many, maybe most companies, it's kind of the centerpiece of their learning technology. So in order to understand a learning management system really quickly, there's three simple things you first have to find out. And in many cases, these questions are almost too fundamental for them to just naturally come up during a sales pitch or during a product demo. But I promise you, these are critical for you to understand if you really want to know how the learning management system works. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to go through those three questions. And while we're going through them, I'm actually going to show you examples in two different learning management systems. We're first going to look at Bridge, and then secondly, we're going to look at Talent LMS. I have no connection to either of these products. I have used Bridge on a couple of different occasions. I've only explored things with Talent. The reason why I'm showing you them is not because I think they're the best or the worst or anything, but they are really good examples of kind of two different ways that learning management systems can organize themselves. And so I think they'll be good juxtapositions with one another so that we can really understand these questions and make sure you understand these questions so that you can apply them to any learning management system that you're happening to look at when you go out into the marketplace. Okay, so the first question that you really need to have answered is, what are the core learning objects of the system? I'm using the term learning object for a couple of reasons. One is that every LMS calls things, has different names for things. Sometimes it's a course, sometimes it's a lesson, sometimes it's a program. And so learning object is just kind of this kind of big picture catch-all. But when I speak about learning object, really what I'm talking about is what is actually assigned and tracked in the system. What are you going to be assigning to people? And then what is going to be tracked by the system? So let me show you an example with Bridge. This is Bridge here. And so if we go in and go to the author section, we see that in the author section, there are these different kinds of courses and, different learning objects that we can create. We can create courses, which are your typical online courses like SCORM files. We can create live trainings, which are just like they say, live trainings. We have checkpoints, which are kind of tasks. There's surveys that you can give somebody a survey. A program is a collection of courses, live trainings, surveys, checkpoints, and then journeys are collections of programs, essentially. And so when you start to get to know Bridge, the thing you find out is that these are the core learning objects, because each one of these items can be individually assigned to people and its completion is individually tracked. So you can think of all of them as separate learning objects. Now, if we go to talent, again, we'll go into the course section, and we'll pretty much find out that in talent, the core learning object is just a course. That's it. Like there's a lot of other things that live inside a course, but the only thing you're assigning and tracking within Talent LMS really is the course itself. So it's super, super simple. So in Bridge, you have a bunch of different learning objects, and then in Talent LMS, you have just one learning object. And again, as you can see, these kind of represent two ends of the spectrum. So now that we understand the learning objects, then the question becomes, where does the content actually go? If I'm, uploading a file or having delivering a course, where does that live? And so it's pretty obvious in Bridge is that the content lives inside each of these learning objects, and it's generally a one-to-one relationship. You're going to have one SCORM file for one course. You're going to have one live training for one live training. You're going to have one task for one checkpoint. So it's pretty simple there. Now that's very different than inside of talent, because like I said, there's just one basic learning object, and then if you go inside of the learning object, the content lives in there, and a lot of content can live in one learning object. These are each different pieces of content inside this one learning object. I know these don't make any sense. I just loaded some random stuff. So if we go to add content here, you'll notice that there's all these different types of content that you can load inside a course, but they'll all just be different units of content inside this one course. So now why does that distinction matter? This is really going to determine how you implement learning, and which works for you is going to determine on kind of the type of learning that you're going to be doing in your organization. Because if we think back to the first question of what are the core learning objects, the course is what's tracked. These individual items of content aren't necessarily individually tracked. And so what that means is if I have a SCORM course, say active listening, I put that same piece of content inside two courses for some reason, and then the same person ends up being assigned both of those courses, they're going to have to complete that content twice, because the core piece of content isn't necessarily tracked. It's just the overall course that gets tracked. Whereas back in Bridge, if we take all of these things and group them into, say, a program, we take a bunch of courses and group them into a program, then each one of those courses is still tracked individually. And since each course is just one piece of content, there's not going to be any confusion there, right? And so this really does represent two different models for how to organize an LMS, where you have many learning objects, but it's kind of a one-to-one relationship between learning object and content, versus other LMSs are set up the way Talent is, where there's very few learning objects and there's kind of a many-to-one ratio of many pieces of content to one learning object. And neither of those are right or wrong, but you need to understand that and think about what that's going to mean to you actually assigning learning within your organization. If you think you're going to have a lot of courses or a few courses or a lot of content or a few pieces of content, understanding that is really, really important. And so then the final piece is you want to understand the question. The final question is, how do these different learning objects interact with one another? I kind of already mentioned here in Bridge how they have programs and journeys. So courses, live trainings, surveys, and checkpoints are really the true foundational layer of learning objects. But then they have layers above that of programs and journeys. And so you can wrap them all together, put them in a program. That program becomes a learning object because it can be assigned itself, but the system is still tracking the individual learning objects that are inside it as well. I hope that makes sense. This is a little bit different than in talent. In talent, actually, you can bring pieces of learning content together through paths, but it's not a separate learning object in and of itself. It's not a separate thing. It's still all contained within the learning object. So I can say, I want, before somebody can take this course, I can basically set prerequisites of other courses that I want them to take, and by kind of daisy chaining prerequisites together, you can create a path, but you have to track it inside the learning object versus tracking it outside the learning object. And so maybe you're getting from my point of view or my tone of voice that I tend to like the bridge style better versus the talent better. But really, truly, that's not because one is better than the other. It really is because it's just what I've been exposed to in the experiences that I have had. The one-to-one relationship of learning object to content really helped me. But in other cases, that might not be true. So really, truly, it's not a right or wrong. The point is to understand how the learning management system works so that you can figure out if it's going to work for your environment. So quick recap here. What are the three questions that you want to figure out when you're looking at any learning management system? And again, these are likely not things that are going to directly be answered by a product demo. You're going to want to ask the rep, hey, how does this work? Can you walk me through these things? And so the first thing is, what are the core learning objects of the system? What gets assigned and what gets tracked within the system? Really important to understand. Once you understand those learning objects, you ask the question, okay, so where does content live? It's always going to live inside some learning object, but does it live in, is it kind of, a one-to-one or a many-to-one relationship? Where is the actual content getting put into the system? And then finally, how do these learning objects interact with one another? Because one thing you're going to find in any learning engagement, anytime you're trying to change somebody's behavior, one interaction, one push isn't going to be enough. You're going to need lots of touch points, lots of different pieces of content. And so making sure you really understand how you're going to link that content together to give it to the learner is incredibly important. Some systems make it really easy. Some systems make it really hard. So I think if you understand those three questions, it's not that you're going to understand everything about the LMS. There's lots of other really important features that are going to be involved with any learning management system, and everyone's going to have different features. But when it comes to the core of how you take your learning management system and use it to implement a learning strategy, I think those three questions are really the key so that you have that foundational understanding and you can get started. So if you're out there looking for a learning management system right now, hopefully this was helpful. I think it's a really good way to quickly diagnose, is this going to work for me or not? And hopefully, hopefully this helps. So thank you very much for being here today. Thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to seeing you again on The Practical Learning Professional.